All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor here at Rice University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Pamela Mann of Harvard University. She's giving a talk entitled How Newspapers Reveal Political Power, the Decline of American Party Organizations. And this is co-authored work from two papers with Alexander Fornés, Andrew Hall, and James Snyder. Pamela's talk will last between 30 and 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. And I'll point out, you can ask a question at any time and we'll get it, but unless it's a clarifying question, I will hold it till the end of the talk. A link to Pamela's papers and slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation, and I'll post those links right after this introduction is finished. Now I'd like to welcome Pamela Mann to the IMC. Pamela, welcome.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to show you guys today about some in-progress work that me and my co-authors have been working on. So as Justin mentioned, this presentation has two accompanying papers. The first one is called How Newspapers Reveal Political Power and is forthcoming at Political Science Research and Methods. And the second paper is a more substantive focus, and that one is The Decline of American Party Organizations, and that is currently a working paper for us. So excited to hear your feedback on things. So just to give some substantive motivation to kick things off, if you think back to the turn of the 20th century in American politics, much of American politics centered around powerful local and state level party organizations. We had these machines, these party machines that dominated elections and governance in broad swaths of the country. For instance, this is a quote from a writer in the Chicago Tribune talking about the Cook County Democratic Party in Illinois, and how it used to be this big, powerful political machine, but now these days it's a victim of indifference. We hardly ever hear about these powerful, we hardly hear about state or local party organizations at all. No one talks about the influence or the power of the, let's say, Massachusetts State Democratic or Republican Party. And so this begs the question, when and why did state parties lose their power? So as I said, historically, state parties played a huge role in elections. They heavily influenced campaigns and election outcomes, and they used the control of political office to distribute patronage and other forms of favors to their members. But today, the names of these local and state party organizations and machines are largely forgotten, and their power is basically a distant memory at this point. And so the question is, like, has the power and how has the power of these organizations dwindled? And if it has declined, has politics in the US become more candidate-centered? So this is our substantive goal, which is in order to study this, we need a new empirical approach that offers a historical view on the waxing and waning power of party organizations. And this requires a new empirical approach because currently we have historical accounts by historians, or we have some analyses based on the level of party competition. The former is limited in scope and time, and the latter only looks at the control over, let's say, party competition after like primary elections are introduced, and is also limited. We want to look at the broad swath across history of to take a historical view on the rise and fall of the power of these party organizations. So this requires a new methodological approach. So more generally, how can we measure the power of political organizations and political actors like these? And this is the second question here is probably more of interest to the audience. And so I'll focus most of the presentation on that. And then at the end, I will show the hopefully the usefulness of this, going back to the substantive question of the decline of American party organizations. And so we argue that we can measure the power of these political organizations and political actors with newspaper coverage. And our claim is that newspapers should, by and large, devote more coverage to more powerful political actors. Newspapers face a decision because they have constrained space on their pages. And so we argue that newspaper coverage can be a reflection of the political influence or the political power of these offices and actors. And so we are going to collect newspapers. We're going to measure coverage by counting different types of instances of mentions. And then we're going to use this to compare the coverage of different actors and different offices. Of course, we have to be careful here because newspapers can also mention people or offices for a lot of other reasons, for instance, for entertainment or for scandals, for any other reason that wouldn't be a reflection of political power per se. And so this is the caveat to our approach, and I'll talk about the limitations later on about this. And so just to give you some details on our new data set on newspapers, we have culled around over 2,700 local newspapers from online sources, mainly databases such as newspapers.com and newspaperarchive.com. Our coverage covers the years 1877 to 1977, so we have a century's worth of coverage here. And it contains almost 70 million pages of text that has been converted into digital text via optical character recognition. And obviously, OCR methods always have a little bit of error in them, so we clean the OCR text by correcting some common errors, by correcting for hyphenation, extra spaces, punctuation, with regular expressions. And so then what results is a clean digital text of 70 million pages of text, of newspaper text across this century in American politics that covers a lot of transitions in at least the American electoral system. To give you an idea of the coverage of our data, this plots the yearly number of pages that we have in the data set across that 1877 to 1977 time span by region. You can see that the coverage obviously increases, the availability increases through the towards as we move into the late 20th century, but we have a pretty good distribution across the United States. There's more details on this data set in the appendix of the first paper of how newspapers reveal political power that you can find, and you can find more details about our cleaning process. And then there's also a map for a more detailed view of the geographic distribution of our newspaper coverage. But we feel pretty good about having a very representative sample of newspaper text across this century in the United States. I also want to emphasize that the newspapers we use are mainly local newspapers, which is what we want to focus on when we're thinking about when we think about our substantive goal of looking at things surrounding local politics, local and state politics. So we have, for instance, some of the top newspapers as in the most coverage we have are from the city newspapers in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or Bridgeport, Connecticut. These are, very local newspapers here. So just to give you an outline of the rest of this talk, I'm going to first show some validation tests for our newspaper-based measure. And so here, since we're presenting a new idea, we want to make sure that a newspaper coverage-based measure actually works for reflecting the political power. And so here we present a variety of different tests, instances in which we already know ex ante, either from the literature or from some other account, shifts in power between two different actors or between different organizations here. And we know ex ante or through different sources already, accepted sources of shifts in power. And we're going to see if our newspaper-based measure also tracks the same shift in power. So I'm only going to go through 3 of these examples in the talk today to save time. But the final 2, the congressional committees and Massachusetts Executive Council example, can be found in the first paper. And then after that, what was really useful is using this newspaper-based measure when there is no other measure of political power. That's why we created this approach in the first place. So we're going to then, I'll show you how we use this newspaper-based coverage measure to look at when and if state party committees declined around the turn of the 20th century, just out in the mid 20th century. And then pinpoint some progressive era reforms to show you how we can use this newspaper-based measure to look at the relative impact of certain progressive era reforms that people have written about in the literature already. Okay. To start, the first example that I'll show for a validation test will be reforms that strip mayors of power. So historically, American cities changed from a mayor-city council form of government to a city manager-city council form of government. So the mayor-council form is when there is a separately elected mayor and a separately elected city council, which has, and the mayor has broad powers, strong powers, to appoint and dismiss department heads, to prepare and administer city budget. In general, just has very strong executive powers in the local level of government. Now, there are some reforms that certain cities in the U.S. adopted that changed this to a council manager form of government. So this is when the city council that is elected, the city council appoints a city manager to oversee the executive branch. And in this case, the mayor is largely ceremonial and holds no true political power at the local level in this instance. And so when we know that a city switches from a mayor-council form of government to a council-manager form of government, we should see a decrease, let's say, in the relative number of mentions in the newspapers of mayors, and a relative increase in city manager mentions. Because this would hopefully reflect the decrease in power of a mayor and an increase in power of the city manager around this reform. So we construct 3 different variables. Each one is relative. So the first one is going to be the relative coverage of a mayor, in which we count for every city. We count the number of mentions of the mayor, and we take that over a denominator of the total mentions of the mayor, the city manager, and the city council. And we do this for every city and every year using our newspaper data. We also do the equivalent to figure out the relative coverage of the city manager and the relative coverage of city council. And so now I'm going to preview the results. I'm going to show you some graphs here. So the upper left-hand graph right here is showing is plotting the relative coverage of mayors. The green dots are the means for cities that have undergone this reform, and the gray squares are the control cities. And this vertical line just represents the time until reform. And so everything on the right side here is going to be after the treatment cities, the green cities, have adopted this reform and switched to a city manager form of government, and everything to the left is pre-reform. And so we see, just looking at the means here, that there is a big shift downwards in the coverage of mayors after a reform, after the city changed to a council, city council, city manager form of government. And we see that this this dot here, this before the reform, the year here is already starting a little decrease, and we think that is because of certain timing, the timing of the reform, because the reform could be adopted earlier in the calendar year or later in the calendar year. And this dot is just, representing that 1 year before reform. And so could be, depending on when that reform fell during the calendar year, is actually picking up some of, let's say, the mentions, the decrease or the increase through the end of that calendar year. And so the takeaway from this upper left is just that the relative coverage of mayors sharply decreases when power is transferred from the mayor to the city manager. And over here on the right-hand side, we see the relative coverage of city managers. So here, right when these reforms hit, we see this dimensions of a city manager. Relative to the control cities there. The final thing I want to point out is this is just this lower right hand is coverage of mayor relative to city council. So this is where the denominator just has mayor plus city council mentions, and this is when we don't measure city managers. One concern might be that this is just a mechanical increase because of this office being created. Even when we take out the city manager mentions from the denominator, we still see a decrease of the mention of of the mayors after these reforms are implemented. And so there's these just preview the diff and diff, and we have the results in the paper. But basically, the takeaway from all of this is that we know ex ante that when this reform happened, the power of mayors the mayors were stripped of their power, and that power was given to city managers, and we see that reflected in our relative coverage measures here. The second validation test I want to talk about is on the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act. So in 1934, the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act was passed, which entailed a substantial transfer of power over a tariff-making policy from Congress to the president. And so here, this is an example in which we're thinking about a specific type of power, that is power over tariff-making. And we're looking at the shift of that power between Congress and the president. And so we know from a lot of historical accounts that the RTAA in 1934 shifted this power from Congress to the president. And so let's see if our newspaper coverage measure also reveals this shift in power. And so to look at this, we're going to look at the mentions of Congress and the mentions of president near the word tariff. So in this example, we're actually going to be anchoring our coverage mentions to specifically two mentions referring to tariff, because we are interested in powers in tariff making. And so here we're going to look at our numerator is going to count the number of mentions of Congress near the word tariff. We actually look for the words Congress, House, or Senate. And then we count the number of times that any of those words appears within 5 words of the word tariff also appearing. And then in the denominator, we look at that plus the mentions of the president within 5 words of the mentions of tariff. And this ratio is going to give us what we call the relative coverage of Congress and tariffs, the relative coverage of Congress when we're thinking about tariff-making policy. And so here, the same thing, this vertical line here is marking 1934 when the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act was passed. And we see we have 5-year mean. Each dot is a 5-year mean there. And we see that after the y-axis is the relative coverage of Congress, the tariffs, that the ratio that I just showed you. And we see that after the RTA was passed, the relative coverage of Congress and tariffs definitely does decrease. We see that jump down there into the bottom green line. And so this tracks exactly what we would expect ex ante, that we know that this act transferred power over tariff making from Congress to the president here. This dot right here, you might be wondering, this is a little bit of an outlier. That's actually during World War I. And so we think that is also there's some outlier coverage there just because of the war situation going on in that 5-year bucket right there. So the last validation example that I'm going to talk about today is going to deal with leadership positions in Congress. And so here we're going to try to test our newspaper measure to see if it accurately captures power that members of Congress would be getting when they assume positions of power. And so we look at individuals before we look at rank and file. We look at members of Congress before they assume a leadership position. That is when they're part of a rank and file, during their leadership position, and after the leadership position. I'm going to right now show you the example where that leadership position is the Speaker of the House. We also do this for the minority leader. So here we're looking at a within legislator design here because obviously a member of Congress is probably going to be picked to be a speaker when maybe over other members because they possess certain qualities that might also be related to garnering media attention. So we're going to hold the legislator constant here. So we're going to do a within legislator design to look at this. And we're going to basically count their surnames. We're going to count the surnames of these legislators, and we're going to, just for accuracy, and since some surnames won't actually be referring to the Speaker of the House, let's say, but somebody else in the United States, we're going to only use cases where certain keywords such as Congress, representative, honorable are going to appear near that surname. And so we're going to be just counting up mentions of these members of Congress and making sure that we're going to apply this filtering technique to make sure that we actually get the member of Congress instead of somebody who isn't a member of Congress, who just shares the same name. And so this graph here shows the coverage in 3 time periods for these members before their leadership position, during their leadership position, and after their leadership position. And we see that there is a jump in coverage during their leadership position, this right here. And just to, since this is a little bit difficult to see, I have put I've put some statistics up here. So here is the mean hits of these names, the mean coverage of these names 5 years before the leadership position, 5 years during the leadership position, and 5 years after the leadership term. So this is for the speakers. So we see that there's a huge order of magnitude shift, huge order of magnitude increase in the coverage of these people and coverage of these speakers from when before they were speaker to when they were speaker, and then a huge decrease once they transition out of their leadership position. And so again, right, so here, this is a case where we know ex ante when a member of Congress is appointed to a leadership position, in this case, the Speaker of the House, there's widely documented that this person is going to have a vast increase in political power. And here we're just using, because we know this, we're testing whether or not our newspaper coverage measure does actually track this. And here this gives us another example that, yes, when we know that there is an ex ante shift in power, our newspaper measure is correctly tracking this shift in power. So these 3 validation tests give us confidence that we can use this idea carefully, but we can use this idea to track relative shifts in political power. There are 2 more tests, as I said, are in the first paper. I'm not going to go over today because of time. But we hope that because of these 5 validation tests cover widely different scenarios, different actors, different levels of government, different types of power, that gives people give people some more assurance that this is something that we can use. And so now the interesting part of this is, okay, now that we have this measure, this approach of using newspaper coverage to measure political power of offices or of individuals, this approach becomes really useful, really powerful when we can use it in an instance in which we haven't been able to measure political power before. And so this, going back to what I started talking about, the example I started talking about today, this is, we're interested substantively about measuring the power of historical state parties. And this has been something that hasn't been systematically done in the literature just because of the previous lack of data. For instance, David Mayhew in his book Placing Parties in American Politics does a reading of newspaper. There's a manual reading of newspapers, of party platforms, of a lot of different text sources, and comes up with a score. And he goes state by state to come up with a state party score of how strong that state party was. So this, we can imagine that what we're doing is kind of a digitization of David Mayhew for today, in which we can basically do this very systematically and very quickly across a century instead of having to one by one go through and read this and read all the newspapers and read all the party platforms manually. And so our goal here is to understand when and if state party organizations lost their political power. And the idea, we adopt the same idea, is to use the newspaper coverage of candidates and look at that relative to the newspaper coverage of party organizations. Because the literature in American politics has hypothesized that the power shift is going between party organizations, and it's shifting from a party-oriented system of politics to a candidate-centered, candidate-focused system of politics. And so we're going to measure the rate at which state and local party organizations are mentioned in the news relative to individual candidates themselves over our time period, 1877 to 1977. So this is going to be using that same source data set, and we're going to apply this to looking at the relative coverage, the relative power of state and local party organizations and candidates. And so we do this by, we define a variable party mentions as the total number of times, summing across articles in a newspaper, in a year, in a state, that the word committee appears within 5 words after either the word Democrat, Republican, or GOP to capture the political party, and after one of the words state, county, district, local, central, executive, regular, or organization. And that second part is to capture the state and local nature. And so this rule to capture the number of counts would capture all the counts for instance, the Illinois Democratic State Central Committee, or the Montgomery County Republican Executive Committee, which were the names of these state and local party organizations. As I said, we almost never hear about these days, but these back in the time when the local and state party organizations were more powerful, previewing our results, this is going to be, these phrases are very frequent, frequently occur in the news. And then we're going to define the variable candidate mentions as the total number of times that candidates for major offices, such as governor, U.S. senator, and U.S. representative, are mentioned. We can also adapt this easily to the total number of times that candidates for state level offices or local level offices are mentioned. We've done a bunch of different variations of party mentions and candidate mentions, and substantively the results are the same. And then we're going to define our main variable, our main outcome variable, which is relative party mentions, which is just going to be party mentions over the sum of party mentions and candidate mentions. So this is basically going to be the relative number of times that parties are mentioned in the news, local and state parties are mentioned in the news, relative to the total coverage of party organizations and candidates. Just to give you an example up here, we see this is plotting the annual medians of that relative party mentions variable across across our the time span of our data set. And the line, that blue line, is the 5-year moving average. And so from this graph, we can see that party organizations peaked at the turn of the 20th century. And there was a bit of a resurgence, a bit of an increase that we see in 1940 to 1950. That's probably synonymous with the New Deal. The relevance of state and local party organizations is now near all-time lows. And so we can also look at patterns in state-specific patterns. Historians have talked about how the decline of different party organizations varies in magnitude and in timing across different states. And we see here, right? So this is just an example of what this looks like for 9 different U.S. states. We can see in some states like California, there's a dramatic decrease in the first half of our data set, but some states like Ohio, Illinois, and New York were more moderate and were not as dramatic, or did not see as dramatic of changes here. Not only did the rise and fall of state and local party organizations vary by state, but they also vary by party. And so here I wanted to show you the average power of party organizations by state and party. And so here we have the Democratic Party organization power. And on this side, we look at the Republican Party organization power. And we see, I wanted to just point out right here, that is North Dakota. And so the North Dakota State Republican Party was pretty powerful in the first half of the 20th century there. The leader of the party actually was so powerful that he moved the state capital of North Dakota to Bismarck, near where he lived, and away from where some of the other party members from the Democrats lived. Over here we have Alabama is one of the stronger Democratic state parties there, and that's with the Black Belt Mules that the historians have talked about, that essentially were responsible for eventually turning Alabama into a one-party state there. But this is just to show you that we can look at we can track the power of party organizations by state and by party. And so now previous scholars have identified certain reforms which may have significantly weakened the power of state and local party organizations. And so it's been widely hypothesized that there are these progressive era reforms that helped erode the power of state and local party organizations and empower candidates. And 2 of them are the Australian ballot, the secret ballot. Before the Australian ballot was put into place, this was largely a reform around the turn of the 20th century, from 1890 to 1920. Before this, the ballots were not secret. They were not, there wasn't a standardized a ballot put out by the state. Different parties could print out their own version of the ballots. And the secret ballot was put in place to prevent vote buying. But how much did this actually impact the power of state and local parties? Party organizations may have had other ways of generating votes. So we want to test whether or not the Australian ballot did lead to the decline of some of state and local party organizations, and if so, how much? And then the second reform that I'm going to talk about today is the introduction of the direct primary. So before the direct primary, their nominees for a party were chosen by convention, were just chosen by the leaders of that political party. And the implementation of direct primary elections removed party organizations' power to choose candidates. And so this is one reform that scholars have hypothesized would have contributed to the decline of state and local parties, but we're not sure by how much or if this actually did contribute to the decline, because party organizations might still have been able to capture the primary election process in some other way. So there are actually two other progressive era reforms that we're currently also working on. One is nonpartisan local elections, and one is civil service reform. Those are in progress, and we're very close to getting the results for those. But in general, our question now is, did these reforms affect the power of parties? And if they affected the power of parties, relatively by how much? And so we're going to use a difference in differences design here and exploit the panel structure of the data and the fact that different states adopted these reforms in different years. So our outcome variable is that relative party mentions variable, the one based on newspaper coverage, relative newspaper coverage. And we have indicators for the secret ballot and for the direct primary, and those indicators equal 1 if during that year that state had implemented had that reform already in place. We also include newspaper fixed effects and year fixed effects. And then we can use several time period windows. We can use the whole period of our data set from 1877 to 1977, or we can use smaller windows around the reform. And so just to show you some of our preliminary results here. And so we have the first two columns here show the coefficients with just the secret ballot and the primary election indicator separately. And then here we have them both on the right-hand side. And then here at this last column, I want to point out that this is when we're restricting our time period to just 1876 to 1950 to try to get a tighter time period around these reforms. And we see in each case that the introduction of these reforms, of their secret ballot or of primary elections, did contribute to the decline in the relative mentions of state and local party organizations. So during this time period, the overall average relative coverage of party organizations, the overall average of our outcome variable is around 3.5%. And that's just because the denominator is very big. And here, this coefficient here of negative 0.56 and this one here of negative 0.66 means that the implementation of the secret ballot led to a decrease of 0.5 percentage points in the share of coverage to state and local party organizations, and a decrease of decrease of 0.6 or 0.7 percentage points of the share of coverage to state and local party organizations. And so since the overall average relative coverage of our state and local party organizations is around 3.5% during this time period, this means that these coefficients represent almost a 20% reduction in the coverage of in the relative coverage of party organizations. And so not only have we mapped out and tracked the rise and fall of local and state party organizations in the U.S. across this century in American history, we can also explain that almost 20% of this decline came from the implementation of these two specific reforms here. So just to wrap up very quickly before questions, what we do with this project is we're introducing a measure of political power using newspaper coverage of relevant political actors. This is broadly applicable. It's historically comprehensive. We've done this for our purposes for 1877 to 1977. And you can apply this to political individuals and also institutions such as party organizations. The limitations of this measure, of course, is when coverage can be there's a lot of noise introduced by celebrity coverage or conflict coverage or scandal coverage. We talk about how you can perhaps filter out scandal coverage. So for us, when we're filtering out scandal coverage of politicians per se, we can just from our counts, our measurement of the counts of party mentions or of the mentions of an office or the mentions of an individual, we can also just subtract out the mentions of that phrase plus some words that have to do with scandals such as bribery, corruption, scandal, the word itself. We have some examples in the paper there. We actually don't find for our purposes that scandal coverage actually it did not affect the substantive results. But that might be that this type of noise might be more problematic in other applications. So you just have to be really careful about that. There is still, however, a risk of measurement error. And so we argue that using a newspaper-based coverage measure is probably best used as a large aggregate outcome variable and to be used in a relative sense. We document substantial decline in the coverage of state party organizations to show how this newspaper-based coverage measure is very useful in cases to track political power where we couldn't have tracked it before. And we pinpoint that primaries and the Australian ballot, both progressive era reforms, both appear to contribute to the decline of state and local party organizations and contribute to the increase of powers of the candidates in American politics. So thank you, and look forward to some questions.
Okay. Oh, I can hear myself. Hold on a second. Sometimes that happens. Put these on to help that. Okay. Thank you, Pamela, for that presentation. At this point, Pamela is available to take questions from the audience. You can take a question, you can ask a question rather, using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And Pamela, I was hoping you could talk, you mentioned a couple of the limitations of your analysis, or of your measure, pertaining to scandal coverage, conflict coverage, and celebrity coverage. And I don't know if you've been on Twitter this morning, but there's a lot of talk about sort of current events, and
yes,
you reflect upon the current administration. And I was wanting to ask you, do you think Donald Trump is more powerful than Barack Obama because the media covers him more obsessively?
So I'm glad you brought that up. So the safest way to apply this is when so we can do this with state and local party organizations and with state and local candidates, just because those are usually inherently boring political actors. don't enter the news. This is where boring is good, right?
To any state politician listening to this broadcast, I'm very sorry.
They'll say they're boring to journalists, right? And to let's say readers in the mainstream reader, they a state representative usually isn't talked about outside of what that state representative really does. And so when you think about some of the presidential candidates or just presidents themselves, this measure we would say this measure cannot be used to measure relative power of those high profile individuals, just because it is very, very difficult to filter out this celebrity coverage or this conflict coverage of that. And so when you're using it for individuals that are inherently boring, you can more easily filter out, let's say, scandals, because let's take the example of a state representative. They're mentioned in the news for, let's say, what they do, or like it reflects how much power or influence they have. They could also be mentioned because they were caught up in a bribery scheme, or like they were found guilty of corruption, or people are suspicious of them to some other type of scandal. Those scandal mentions are very easy to filter out using what I mentioned at the end there, because that is always going to be some sort of politically linked scandal. And so as long as you have a sense of a sort of relevant dictionary of words that would relate to that type of scandal, you can use that to basically filter out those mentions, which is what we do in the second paper, and the results, we present those results in the appendix, and they don't seem to change the magnitude of the relative magnitudes of our results, and so probably confirms that these actors are safe, these middle of the run political actors are pretty safe to use.
Another thing I wanted to ask about, and this is actually relates to a question that we received from Thomas Ball. So he asked, would you speak to how you dealt with classic time series issues in a panel data model structure for such a long time series? These issues include autocorrelation, co-integration, and stationarity. And my related question to that is, it seems like states might have different media cultures, right? The newspapers in Montana probably don't operate like the newspapers in California. And that sort of seems highly relevant in terms of trying to judge political power, right?
Yes. So you have to, so to answer both of it, so you have to keep in mind that this is always a relative measure. And so it's relative to, let's say, if we're looking at Montana, of course, like the media coverage in Montana is going to be different systematically from the media coverage, let's say, in New York. But in Montana, what you're looking at is, this is why we emphasize the relative part of our measure, because you're looking at the relative coverage of Montana newspapers of, let's say, the Montana political parties and the Montana candidates, right? And so that's going to be the relative measure there. And then you also do that relatively within the New York newspapers only for New York. And so the biggest, I wanted to mention this. So the biggest concern in using such a broad swath, as Thomas mentioned, from a century's worth of data, is that a lot of newspapers will change in like their standards and their like we can have the entrance of, if you I don't want to go all the way back to my slides, but in the beginning of the slides, I had that graph mapping our coverage, and we see that the number of pages that we have in our data set gradually increases the closer we get to 1977. And so one concern is that we're capturing new newspapers that are entering that have different standards, that have different, styles of reporting styles as they're coming in throughout time. And so that is, I think, a major concern. And so we basically use newspaper fixed effects, and we look within newspaper and keep the newspaper characteristics constant for that.
So I was looking at your, it's actually an unnumbered table in your slides.
Okay. Sorry.
It just makes it hard to refer, but it's a difference in design, right? And so what you're doing is looking at changes over time, trends, in other words, in different states, and then comparing for that cutoff point. And obviously, these newspapers are all in different states. And I was thinking, well, okay, we might see a bigger decline in one state relative to another just because its political culture is different, right? So this is the so-called common trends assumption. Parallel trends assumption being broken. And maybe I see you have newspaper linear trends in there, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit, because that's relative. That's important for the spatial sort of comparability of the different newspapers.
Yeah. So the diff and def assumption that we have for that reforms table is that there's going to be no unobserved heterogeneity in fixed state characteristics that's correlate, or fixed, newspaper state characteristic that is correlated with the reforms. And you bring up a good, so we do try to tease that out by using the newspaper linear time trends. But this is something that we are trying to figure out, like what else we can do to convince people that the assumption is, let's say, satisfied. If there's any suggestions on what else might be convincing, I'd love to hear them.
I also wanted to bring up, so could you go back to the question that Thomas asked and talk about autocorrelation, co-integration, and stationarity?
We don't address any of those. I don't think we have any specific robustness checks that address those. I think I'll have to look into that. I think we're just operating on the assumption that, somebody reporting today is going to be different. Like they're only going to be reporting based on what is going on at that moment in time, and that there's no correlation across that. But we'll have to think about that some more.
I mean, if this were a classic diff and diff where you just had a single cut point and you were looking at differences across time, maybe that wouldn't be a big a deal. But I'm looking at your trends, one could make the claim that that's a random walk, right? And
we do have, it is a cut point. It is a cut point in time, though, because it is like there's a pre-reform period and the post-reform period.
Well, but like you said in your talk, the ballot, for example, is introduced at different times in different states, which it's neither here nor there, because I'm confused about exactly what the effect of potentially non-stationary would be, because if this were correlating two trends, I would know there for sure there would be a problem. The fact that you have cut points at different times, it's not as immediately clear whether that would present a problem or not.
Yeah, it's not. I'll have to think more about that. I don't think it was. I'll have to think more about that. Yeah, because we are just we're like collapsing the cut points all too. Yeah, I'll have to think more about that. I don't have a direct answer right now.
I want to ask or go to another question that was asked. It was also Thomas who was asking this. I noticed I think we both noticed that your time series ends in 1977, which is, that's a long time ago now. So why did it stop? It seems like there's been a big change in newspaper culture between then and now.
Yes. So we ended 1977 for both substantive reasons and for just data availability issues. Pre-1977 is the safest for us in a legal sense, because that's when...
Is it copyright?
Yeah. So that's that. We are very safe in that copyright is no longer in place for that when we started collecting this text. Secondly, we are more... So the substantive reason is that we're more comfortable knowing about how newspapers what the standards of journalism and practices were until 1977. If we were looking at more contemporary, more recent years, you run into the issue of a lot of wire services, and like the delocalization of news. So, like more and more newspapers are going to use wire services, so they don't report they don't have their own, like let's say a small city in Montana is not going to have the same amount of resources these days as it did before when print newspapers were the primary source of information. And so in recent years that you'd have to account for the changes in journalistic practices. We have the period 1877 to basically to sum up, we have the period 1877 to 1977 because that is a period that we were interested in to look at these progressive era reforms. That was actually the motivation for all of this. And secondly, because we are going to have to do more work on, one, double checking the legal side of things, and two, thinking about how changes in journalism would affect this type of relative measure for recent years.
Do you think, in some of your validation tests where there's a clear cut point and, I don't believe there are any cultural changes in the United States or in newspapers or whatever. For example, in your mayor council example, that's very believable. In the state parties example, I wonder, because the time when that was happening, I'm scrolling through your slides now, the big changes between 1900 and then 1920, and then maybe a little bit more between 1920 and 1960. Yeah. And those were times when state party power was probably changing, but the relationship of newspapers to government officials, elected officials, was also changing. And the way that newspapers sort of sold themselves to the public was also changing. And I'm wondering the extent to which you think you can filter any effect of that out of your analysis.
Well, so the concern would be that, so there would only be a problem if the changes in how newspapers interacted, let's say, with the subjects of who they cover is going to be different for, let's say, interacting with a state party and like interacting with the candidate. Right, because as long as it's okay if the style of journalism is changing, that affects both, right? Because we're taking a ratio. So if both the numerator and the denominator get the same change, then the relative measures should still be okay. The concern is when, let's say, it's only affecting, let's say, the coverage of candidates and not the coverage of a state political party. And so the example that I can think of is if, let's say, there are candidates or individuals who very much want to actively keep themselves out of the news, right? For certain reasons. Robert Moses is very famous for trying to keep himself out of coverage. He didn't want to be covered in the newspapers. And so that, right, would change if there's more of that happening in the mid 20th century, if individual politicians get more power to, let's say, get more say in whether or not a journalist will cover them or not. That would be a problem there. And I think that's something that we are consistently thinking about. I think, again, when we're dealing with candidates for state, I think you have to look at the office then. If we think that when we're dealing for like candidates for state representatives or state Senate, that there isn't as big of a concern there. And if journalists are covering state representatives and state senators or candidates for those offices more during those periods, that's exactly what we want to pick up, right? We want to pick up if they're covering them more, just because that's where the political influence is now concentrating, rather than, let's say, the state or local party organization.
Just one last question before we go. So Thomas asked, there are 2,700 roughly papers and 70 million pages over 100 years. How many cities are in the analysis?
Yeah, there's I don't have that number off the top of my head. We have a list in the appendix of some of the, there is a map in the appendix of the How Newspapers Reveal Political Power paper that is shaded state by state and gives you the number of different newspapers we have by state. And so that would be the number of different, usually there's never multiple newspapers covering the same state. That only happens in rare instances. So if you sum up the numbers, if you look at the numbers within each state, it's that map is in the appendix. It's the blue shaded map. That'll give you the number of cities, rough count. We also have a table in the appendix that shows the most frequent newspapers, the highest number of pages we have per newspaper there. So that information can be found in the appendix.
I actually want to ask one more question that just came in from P.A. Garay. Does your state party organization data consider coverage of party bosses? Because I think it only measures mentions of the party organization.
Yes.
And the comment is that your measure doesn't seem to accurately represent the power of the Democratic Party in Illinois during certain time periods.
Yeah, so like we have, Illinois, the Cook County, that's a good point. So the Cook County, right, the Cook County machine there, let's say Richard Daley, right, was the boss during his time. And there's a lot of mentions of him instead of just like, let's say, the Cook County, Illinois party organization. So we do have we do have counts. We do have measures of the party boss, that we can get measures of the party bosses when we know who they are. The problem, the reason why we don't do that systematically, or we don't enter that in the paper, is because it's really even hard to figure out the existence of these bosses and who they are. And just because there actually isn't that much outside of the really famous ones, there just isn't that much coverage of even to figure out year to year who the leader of this, of the local or state party organization is. So I will say, when we do just from my reading of these articles, when they do mention a individual, one of the, let's say one of the party bosses, it usually does come also in this with a mention of the name of the machine, or of the local or state party organization. But yes, if we wanted to be thorough, and we would want to also look at the mentions of the bosses. That's hard. That's just hard because of the existence of the names. Secondly, we also are interested in the power of that organization per se, and not of that individual, because a lot of these bosses also had other things going on and would receive coverage for other things that they were doing in the area, not just related to their political influence.
We're out of time. There are several comments or suggestions for your research that we get a record of those, so I'll forward them to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you everyone for sending in those suggestions and for the questions.
But I'd like to thank Pamela for being our presenter this week. I want to remind everyone that her presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to share the presentation with someone else or watch it again later. I'd also like to note that this is the last IMC talk for fall 2017. I'd like to thank all our presenters and viewers for being a part of the IMC this semester. Our schedule will resume on Friday, February 9th, 2018, with a talk by Tepe Yamamoto of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. If you're interested in giving a talk in the IMC next school year, 2018-2019, please contact me at justin@justnessery.com, or you can see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com for more details. Thanks, Pamela, for being here today.
Thank you.
And I'll see everyone next year.